In this lesson, we will create our first API test with Playwright. But first, let's take a look on API service which we will be using, and that is this regress.in. This is a live, real-time API service which is completely free to use, no registration needed. And it's built for anyone who needs a live API server to serve him a real response and not just local fake data. So it's good for all kinds of use cases. If you are a front-end developer who needs real API response for an application or demo, you can use it. Or if you want to learn API testing, this is also the best place to be. In our case, we can test all types of major requests like get, post, put, and delete, and learn how to make assertions using Playwright. So if you scroll down, you can get some information about this service. And here we have the list of all the endpoints which are available for us, with how the API endpoint looks like, what is the response. So we can practice a lot of stuff, and also we know how to make assertions. You have some information about if you want to learn more, but in our cases, all we care about are these API endpoints, which we will be using requests, and then we will be asserting the responses using Playwright. So let's go to our text editor, and inside our API spec, again we can start at the top with importing. So again we need to import test and expect from Playwright. Then let's create a describe block, test.describe, and in this case we can use that parallel because we can run all the tests in parallel sequence, because we will be calling the different endpoints with each request. This means you can run all your tests in parallel always. So the execution of API tests is super fast and easy to use. So you will see. Now let's give it a description. API testing. And first, we can create a test, and I'm gonna name it simple API test dash assert response status. And take a look here, I'm typing async, but instead of page, I actually need to pass something called request, because we will be calling requests on the API and we will be not using page to automate the actual browser. So how does it look like? Typically you start with creating a variable, name const response. And here I'm gonna need to use Playwright to use the function request to call the request on the API server. So await request that, and as you can see now I have a lot of options, but in this case I want to call get because I want to get some data from that API, and now I need to provide the URL. So if you take a look, we need to grab this regress.in /API. And now we can take a look at some of the endpoints. Let's say we want to grab a single user, and you can see that the URL of the endpoint is API users /and number. So let's type users, and in this case let's keep number 2. But before we move on, it's always a good practice to extract this base URL into the variable, because we will be calling a lot of requests, so we don't need to repetitively use this part of the URL. So at the top, let's create a variable and name it base URL and paste the value. And here we can actually use it. So I'm gonna delete this part. And we can use base URL just like this. And now if we run the test, the Playwright will send the GET request to this URL. And what we can do as a first typical assertion is that you can assert that the response status achieved the number of 200, which means success. And that means, hey, we have called the request on this URL and we have received some data. So let me show you. You can type expect response dot status, and it's a function that to be 200, like this. And you should already know that 200 is a code for success. That means if we call a GET request to this rest in API /user/2, we should get some data. So let's see, open terminal and run npm run tests API, hit enter. And as you can see, our API test passed. So let's now see what would happen if we change the assertion not to 200, but for example to 400. Now the expect should fail. So let's see what's going to happen if we rerun the API test again. And you can see we have an error, and we have an error on expected 400, like here, but we received the response of 200. So as you can see, using API tests with Playwright is almost the same like using UI tests. Very simple, very intuitive, and very easy to use the assertions. So let's take this back to 200, and let me show you a different kind of error. Let's say I change this URL and not to target users too, but I want to try something completely invalid. So I'm gonna hit the endpoint which is not existing. So I'm gonna type some random numbers because this user definitely not exists. And let me run the test again. And you can see the test failed again. And this time we have received the 404 error, which means not found. Which means we have called a request.get on something which doesn't exist. And this can be a typical good example for a second test. So now I'm gonna create a second test. So test simple API test, and I'm gonna give it a title assert invalid endpoint. And here we can basically copy and paste this. Oops, I have a typo here. It's a request. And now I'm gonna change this to something like non-existing endpoint. And I'm gonna change the assertion to get 404. Now we can run the test. And you can see our second test is passing. So congratulations, you have successfully created your first two tests. I mean API test using Playwright. Again, the idea behind the API testing in Playwright is very simple. You create a describe block, you create a test, but instead of passing a page object, you pass it the request object, which gives us an option to call the requests on the API server. And the construction is again very simple. You create variable of response and you call request.get or put, post, or another type of request. You specify the endpoint, which is typically the URL of your API, and some endpoint, and then you can call assertions. But now we are working with very simple assertions like response status, so we can verify if we actually get some data, or if we call it for non-existing endpoint, we should get 404, which means something wasn't found. But in the next videos, I'm going to show you how to actually parse the response data and assert the content of the data which we receive by calling this endpoint. because asserting status is not enough. But it's okay and fine for the first simple example to get the idea how the API testing works, especially in Playwright. And in the next videos, we will go one type of request one by one, and we will learn how to call put, post, delete, etc., and how to do proper assertion, how to extract data, and how to validate the data which are coming back from the API server. So that's all for this video, and see you in the next one.